What was the relationship, as you remember, between your community and the Birmingham Police Department? Do you ever remember any incidences in your community between the police and individuals in your community?
I never saw the police in our community. We lived in a very quiet community, a community of a family community. As a matter of fact, when I was in the 8th grade, I never knew anybody that was divorced. None of my friends' parents were divorced. I didn't know what that meant. We might have been poor people, but we were proud people with dignity. I remember that if there were ever any conflicts in the community, that they would come to the men, my dad, other men. If young boys had gotten in trouble, their parents threatened to tell my dad. Other fathers, they would be in big trouble. At that time, all men disciplined all the children.
Are you suggesting there were not children in your community that lived with just their mother or their grandmother and a father was not in the home? Do you remember?
I don't remember anybody that didn't have a father at home. I just don't remember anybody that didn't have two parents. And during most cases, most grandparents were still inside the house or next door.
Right. So it was an all-inclusive kind of community, and those extended families, because you actually had people in your community with just like family who may not have been blood relatives. Is that correct?
Exactly. Well, we were just recently, my mother and I were talking, and I said, you know, when you're young, you don't question anything. There were people that I called Aunt so-and-so or cousin so-and-so, and you never really knew if they were blood relatives or not. It didn't matter, but you didn't question it.
You mentioned that your father and your mother, I assume, were actively involved in the struggle. You did say that all ministers were spokespersons for the movement, but there were some ministers that did not participate, but your father and your grandfather obviously did. Can you tell me the extent of their involvement in the movement at the time?
My father had a very personal stake in the movement. My father was very outspoken. He was not afraid of white people. He always said what was on his mind, and it often got him in trouble.
For instance, how did he get
for
in?
example, when we were very small children, maybe I was 6 or 7, we were on the way to the hospital to pick my mother up from the hospital, and the police stopped my father, and they got really smart. They said something about, "Get out of the car, boy." And of course the children, we were on the back seat, and my dad said, "Who are you calling boy?" And the cop says, "You're going to be in trouble." My dad said, "If you put your gun on top of the car and fight me fair, I'll show you who a boy is." And they took him to jail. I can remember that it was cold, that it was very damp, raining, and the police left us standing on the sidewalk. My mother had just come out of the hospital. We'd never made it home. They left us there, children, small children, and my mother was not dressed. She didn't have a coat. She was coming from the hospital. And they took my father to jail, but he was not afraid. Whenever people got in trouble in the community, my father, along with some of the other men, there were 4 or 5 men, young men, that everybody came to when somebody was in trouble. None of these men were afraid of whites. They were not afraid. They were protectors of the community. If something happened, they would take care of it.
Were your parents involved with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights prior to the 63 demonstrations? Do you remember if they were or not?
I can remember slipping off to maybe 2 meetings without our parents knowing about it. But after the bombing, it was a nightly ritual. Whenever the mass movement was called, everybody was there.
Well, prior to the bombing, in April, the bombing was in September.
Yes.
In April and May, there were marches practically every day. Were you involved in that?
We were downtown. I can remember the particular march at Newberry's downtown. I look at Newberry's today and I see its ruin. I see the plight of the building, and I just remember, and if you're quiet enough, you can hear the water, you can hear the people screaming still, you can hear the dogs. And I said, why? Why?
You, of course, at that point was a teenager, a young teenager at the time. So
I was probably about 12 then, or 13.
And what do you remember about firstly about the mass meetings? How would you describe the mass meetings that you attended?
They were very intense. Even as a child, you knew that there was something special in the air. At the meetings, it was like church, but it was different from church. I can remember on the stage, Dr. King, Mrs. King, Fred Shuttlesworth, Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond. Julian Bond and Jesse Jackson were young boys. They didn't look much older than we were, but they were there. And Reverend Woods and other people that I can't remember their names. There was another older gentleman. They called him Sunshine. He's dead now. Sunshine was always close to my parents, and he kept us all informed of what was going on. I can remember when they bombed Attorney Shore's home. And so every day there was something to let black people know that they were not safe. They would intimidate our parents and tell them, if you go to these meetings, you're not going to have a job. Well, the jobs that they had, they couldn't make a living for their children anyway, so it didn't matter. They would sit on the porch at night, my father and other men with shotguns and rifles. They would sit on the front porch all night just to make sure that white people didn't harm us. They would go to other communities and band together and watch over the houses to make sure that people were not bombed in their sleep.
Were your parents or your home ever threatened? Did people ever call your home? Why were they sitting on the porch? I assume that was on your porch.
On everybody, on every
community.
There was somebody in every block. After I went to West End, they set up all night across the street from our house, in the back of our house, on the side of our house.
Now, going to West End, that means that you transferred then from Parker High School to West End High School. But before we get to West End High School, let me just ask you just a couple other questions about the movement itself. You, in 1963, participated in demonstrations. Did you also participate in any of the classes and the training sessions that were done with young people that were going to demonstrate?
I don't think they were called classes necessarily, but we would sit in church as though it was church, and they would tell us what to do. The strategists were the men. They would say, we're going to walk down this street, and when the police come, then we'll come from the other street. And when the other police come, we'll come. They were very smart. As a child, I loved the meetings because I always thought black people were smarter than the cops because they were always surprised. And I can remember that they would always send somebody to infiltrate the meeting, and how Dr. King would stand on the podium and call them out. It was though he knew who the Judas was.
And a black person that would be sent?
A black person that would be sent in. We called them the Uncle Toms. The people that would, or some, I can't say that, I can't label all people that. There were some people there for whatever reason that the white man would demand that they report back, that they would bring back information. And for whatever reason, they had to do it.
These individuals were known to be...
Some were known and some were unknown. I just remember that Dr. King would speak to them as Judas, and then there were whites that would stand in the back of the church and take notes. I can remember Bull Connor as a child, and the police, that they would be outside of the church. They were very visible. They always wore sunglasses. You could see the malice on their faces. You knew that they meant you harm. But they were very bold about infiltrating the church. They didn't have any respect. But we prevailed.
Tell me about, what do you remember about participating in demonstrations?
Some of us went because it was fun. Until the 4 children were killed. When you're very young, you don't know why, but you're caught up in the emotions. My parents talked to us. They knew that something would come, eventually come. I'm not saying that they had the foresight to see what eventually did happen, but I knew they wanted something better for their children.
Do you ever remember being in a demonstration and being attacked by the police or by the firemen?
No, I remember just being in the crowds and running. To say that I was bitten by a dog, no. To say that I was knocked down by the water hoses, no. But we were in the crowds when the dogs were turned loose. We were in the crowds when the water was turned on, but there were so many people. I can remember when they would pick demonstrators up, and we were still very young. So it was the older children, the high school children, that went to jail. I can remember when all of the city jails were full, then they started putting people in the Bessemer jails. And when the Bessemer jails were full, they started putting people in the, I think they put them in Fair
Park.
Fair Park, yes, okay. Fair Park, every conceivable facility. And by this point, blacks had come to realize that going to jail was no big deal. There was nothing criminal about it. So I knew older teenagers who would go to jail and be released and go back that same night to get arrested again.
But you were never arrested, right?
I was never arrested there.